I have lived through the names. We first were colored, and then we moved to Negro, and then we wanted to go through African American or Afro something to connect up with our African heritage. And then all of a sudden we realized how beautiful black was.
Is there an African American culture? Is there a Black American culture? In Milwaukee, Wisconsin, we asked 50 African Americans from all major sectors of life, and all said yes. To some, the culture is best explained as a fusion of ethnic practices.
When I think of African American culture, I think of the blending of African culture and American culture as we now define it. Despite the fact that we've been in this country, African people or descendants of African people, for hundreds of years, there are still some values and traditions that have been carried down over those years. And when I think of the blending of the two cultures, for example, when we talk about the village in raising a child, we know traditionally in Africa that village was all of the people that lived there, the extended families. We've had that throughout our history in this country as well.
Many practices that are today considered Black American were brought over by indigenous Africans, then adapted to American life. Some of these practices are as basic as communicating and eating.
The griots of Africa were wise men, were musicians, were poets. That oral tradition of Africa was brought here. It was probably even maximized by the fact that it was illegal for the slaves to learn how to read and write, so they had to depend on their verbal communication.
Well, one thing I think that is unique about African American language styles is rhyming. Not so much unique, everyone rhymes. Poets are in every culture. But I do recall that as a kid, one of the things that we did was rhyme a lot. For instance, in playing hide spy, we would say, hide spy, stick 'em in the eye, who's that stole my apple pie? Are you ready?
And now you look at rap, and rap is really an evolution along the lines of the different ages, from the oral tradition of Africa to the need for slaves to communicate when they could not at times read and write, to the last poets, to the rappers. They're simply barriers of that tradition in modern times.
I think as you look at Black or African American culture, there are a myriad of differences between that of European or Asian or other types. But specifically when you look at church, there are some marked differences. The European culture uses something that's called count and measure. In other words, everything has a specific time and place. A church service starts at 9 o'clock and ends at 10, versus an African American style, which is affect or feeling. In many Black churches, if you ask what time the service ends, no one can tell you, because it's based on how long the preacher preaches or the choir sings.
A lot of the things that we now eat are native of Africa. And I think it's important that if you look at the migration from the South to the industrial North, a lot of people brought with them skills, and they also brought with them seeds and that sort of thing to the North so that they could eat some of the food that they were used to eating.
Food is a mixture of what our ancestors knew from Africa and what we had to deal with in the United States, and particularly in the South. And some very tasty products developed, such as the way we fix our greens, cornbread, our black-eyed peas, how we make sweet potato pie.
Others we interviewed said Black culture is best explained through the ongoing response to social injustice, particularly racism, in America?
In coming up here, most black Americans, and that's why I say that instead of African Americans, we were more so involved in the civil rights movements, about fighting for our rights, for equal schools, equal everything, to be able to be equal here in America. And so the black Americans focused on freedom here in America.
To some, the struggle of blacks in America has defined African American culture in ways that indigenous Africans would not understand.
It was made apparent for me during a trip where I was at the African American Summit with Dr. Leon Sullivan, and the host hotel was putting on entertainment. Part of that entertainment ended up being a play by about Amos and Andy. And we found it very offensive as African Americans, and so there was this rumbling that started to go through the crowd as we began to hear what was going on in the theater, and as the people in blackface walked out. And when the indigenous African people were a little confused about what was going on and why we were starting to have this reaction. And so we had to explain to them that this was very offensive for us, coming from our experience as African Americans in this country. So that let me know that there is a culture that we have that's unique among any African people in the entire diaspora. We here in America have a culture.
African American culture developed in both ways, through an imaginative blending of ethnic traditions and the ongoing struggle for social justice in this country. What we shall see is that both forms of adaptation led to highly creative contributions by Black Americans in local and national communities. But to understand how this came about, we must first look at some of the important markers in the historical experience. The ancestors of most Black Americans once lived in societies in West and Central Africa. The majority of these societies were complex, structured market economies where Blacks participated as producers, merchants, traders, and entrepreneurs. While some Africans traveled freely to America, most came as victims of the transatlantic slave trade. Africans brought with them practices associated with horticulture, construction, boat building, art forms, folklore, medicine, aesthetics, rites of passage, and forms of family and social organization. Slave labor was central to American development. Economic historian Joseph Inokori states that 75% of American products traded between 1500 and 1850 were produced by Africans and their descendants in the Americas. The practice of slavery evolved during this period, especially in the area that would become known as the United States. During the earliest days of the North American colonies, Black labor alone was sold, and for finite periods of time. When these labor contracts ended, Blacks were freed and had many of the same rights as whites in America. Between 1680 and 1775, almost 2/3 of the white population from Europe immigrated to the American colonies with labor contracts themselves. But Africans and their descendants had particularly strong skills in producing subtropical agricultural products. Southern states became more and more dependent on their plantation economies. Laws were passed to make Black Africans only slaves for life. Slavery continued to play a fundamental role in building the U.S. economy until well after the end of the Civil War. Throughout this period, abolitionist groups arose in opposition to slavery. Both whites and free Blacks participated in these movements. One activity was the Underground Railroad, a loosely knit collaboration of organizers and routes that helped slaves escape their bondage via boats, rail cars, and wagons. Wisconsin was a leading state in the Underground Railroad. A typical route to freedom was that taken by a young slave, Caroline Quarles, who fled slavery in St. Louis in 1824, while a posse trailed her in promise of a $300 reward for her capture. She took a steamboat to Alton, Illinois, then boarded a stagecoach from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Underground Railroad conductors guided her from Wisconsin to Detroit, where she eventually crossed the Michigan border into Canada.
Escaped slaves would come to Wisconsin. People like Sherman Booth would defend them, and the lawyers would defend them. And we had the Underground Railroad going through. In fact, there's a spot over by Clarence L. Johnson and Cleopatra Johnson Park, which is off of 17th and Brown, 17th and Brown and Fond du Lac, where Brown, Fond du Lac, and 17th Street come together. That's where Caroline Quarles was stayed in an old Farmer Brown's house there, and was able to escape through the Underground Railroad into Canada, and was represented by a law firm that later became Foley and Lardner.
Like Caroline Quarles, the city's first African-American artist arrived in Milwaukee through the Underground Railroad.
I found out that there was an artist named Joe, and that's all the information we have, because he was a runaway slave, and Wisconsin was one of the stops for the Underground Railroad. And Joe stayed with this family. And at this time, I don't have the name of the family because I didn't look, but Joe stayed with this family, and the family would hide him when the people that were looking for slaves that had run away would come along. They hid him in a barrel outside of their store, and the children would play games on top of the barrel so that the people who were looking for slaves wouldn't find him.
Free blacks had lived in Milwaukee since the turn of the 19th century. Milwaukee's first mayor, Solomon Juneau, had an African-American cook named Joe Oliver. Most of the earliest arriving blacks who settled in Milwaukee were self-employed or semi-skilled workers and lived in every area of the city. Many owned property. Much would change during the period called the Great Migration, which began in 1910. Many push-pull factors would contribute to urban migration of blacks all over the United States. Factors including worsening racism in the South, higher wages in the North, and the wartime decline in European immigration, which reduced the number of available workers in industrial cities. Milwaukee actually played a central role in this migration. A city industry, Alice Chalmers, produced the cotton-picking machine, which put many blacks in the South out of work. In addition, some local industrialists began recruiting African Americans from the South.
They would actually send recruiters down south. They didn't bring them up in passenger trains. They put them in boxcars and brought them up here. There were barracks and everything up on Jones Island where they could live. Dining rooms, everything they wanted was over there as long as they worked. Of course, this was the beginning of the in-migration of blacks into Milwaukee. They did well. They stayed here, and they came up as individuals. Their families didn't come with them initially, but then they brought their families up and their relatives.
Those folks had great work ethics coming from the South, having being out in the field when it's 100 degrees and working all day, and in farming you really don't count hours, so you're out there working until a job is done. So that's a little bit different than people that are used to working 8 hours and at the end of the day you're done. So they were really getting some folks that really knew how to work.
In the next 60 years, the population of African Americans in Milwaukee grew over 100-fold. Most blacks who arrived in the city during and after the Great Migration were less educated and less skilled than the early migrants. The combination of increasing numbers, the lower socioeconomic status of the new arrivals, and American ideas about race all played roles in a series of constraints African Americans would face in Milwaukee. Policies often worked to segregate black communities and, curiously, to break up these communities as well. Ghettos would develop in black urban areas for a variety of reasons. These included laws where municipalities zoned industrial areas that surrounded black neighborhoods to keep blacks contained in those areas, restrictive agreements where deeds stipulated who could and could not purchase the property, the refusal of financial institutions to approve mortgage loans for African Americans, and redlining in the private housing market.
Yes, back in 1976, I worked for a major finance company in the Capitol Court area. And I was told when I was hired that I was brought in specifically to work in the minority neighborhood. But we had quotas of loans that we would grant, and they were based essentially on streets. You know, if you went past 76th Street, we did not give loans out south of that. And essentially, we're talking about African American or Spanish speaking neighborhoods. While we didn't have a map that had red lines, everyone in our office knew that if an address ended in a certain zip code, the chances of that loan being agreed upon were very slim.
But despite the constraints, some who recalled life in segregated areas also remembered the strength of these communities.
Segregation actually did have some positive points, believe it or not. One of it is that middle class blacks lived alongside poor blacks. The result was that the middle class provided leadership for the African American community.
And parents tended to look after each other's children.
In your community, you were a very tight-knit community, especially on your own block, because you would have block parties and barbecues and everyone knew each other. That if you went down on the other end of the block and say you busted someone's window, the person's window who you might have busted might have disciplined you. On your way coming home, there might have been another mother that might be out on the porch that saw you and disciplined you. And then by the time you got home, your mother was sitting there waiting on the porch, waiting for you to get home, because it's already made it circulate all the way down the block of what you had done.
By mid-century, most African Americans in Milwaukee lived within 1 square mile in the central city, an area known as Bronzeville. Walnut Street was the community's business and entertainment center. But during the 1950s and 1960s, 2 government programs displaced many in this community. One program was the Urban Renewal Administration, which had been designed to improve central city housing. Many blocks in Bronzeville were slated for revitalization, and residents on these blocks were forced to sell their homes or were offered alternative housing in other areas of the city. During the same time period, the Milwaukee County Expressway Commission was building 2 major freeway corridors in the heart of the city. One cut directly across Bronzeville, discarding Walnut Street as the center of the community.
I spent my entire childhood hearing about the neighbors and the friends and just this social group that my parents had blended with on 7th and North Avenue. And so there was a yearning and a nostalgia there that you don't have when you move voluntarily and you move to a new house and you make new neighbors. It was a forced situation for them. And you know, through the years, they tried to keep in touch with the neighbors and friends that they'd made there. And that was difficult to do because everyone was scattered all over everywhere. It just kind of dispersed that neighborhood everywhere.
What Urban Renewal did was, while it also gave us opportunities that we would not otherwise possibly have, it also, there was a price to pay for it, in the sense that urban renewal started to break down the family, the village itself, the physical structure, and that families started moving into different living situations, living arrangements, high-rise apartments, apartment complexes for low-income families and things. And with the different choices that we have, families started moving away from one another. So whereas I might have been at one time spending most of my life next door to a family member or a very close friend of the family, now I am more likely than ever to be living next door to someone who is a complete stranger, who may not even have a clue to the lifestyle, my heritage, or anything about me as a person and my ethnic background.
Instead of increasing housing options for African Americans, in some ways, these policies actually led to housing shortages.
There had been a significant number of African Americans who had bought housing. They couldn't get loans from the bank, so they bought housing from individuals on a kind of credit basis where they paid the individual on a monthly basis. Now, it was like renting, except that when they paid the complete price, the house belonged to them. But when they never had the title to the house until they paid the complete price. So when urban renewal came in and the expressway, many of these individuals who had begun to buy housing found themselves with no housing at all, because money paid by the government went to the individuals who had title to the property.
To some, the disintegration of Bronzeville, with its business and entertainment center, was the loss of the central city's soul.
In Milwaukee, when I'm driving around the city, in the inner city at night, it's basically dead. You don't see a lot of people out walking up and down the streets having fun like you see on the east side or downtown on Water Street. I drive through there just because the people are going in and out of bars and they look like they're having so much fun. And then when I drive back to where I live on 18th and Wright, I'll go down 3rd Street or up Fond du Lac. You see nothing. It's like you rarely see people out in the evenings.
The African American community in Milwaukee began to move further north and further west. In many central city neighborhoods, only the lowest income blacks remained. Within a decade, another government policy would play a role in further disrupting the community. As a response to a lawsuit alleging illegal segregation in Milwaukee public schools, a federal court ordered busing of students outside their neighborhoods to achieve racial balance in the classroom.
What happened was the plan was developed in such a way that the burden for busing was placed on the backs of black children. And what occurred was they would go into various attendance areas and bus black children out to as many as 100 different elementary schools throughout this community in order to promote desegregation. And in fact, there's a document that the Milwaukee Public Schools put together that says that it is the role of MPS to give whites the psychological guarantee that they will never have to go to a school that is predominantly minority. So given that whole philosophical view, the way that the plan was implemented was in fact on the backs of black children.
To some residents, busing offered certain positive opportunities. However, most of the residents who were interviewed recalled the negative impacts of busing.
Well, I was in the 3rd grade when I was bused from the old 21st Street School to Burbank, which is on the south side. And now that I'm older, my thoughts were that it was that we couldn't learn unless we were with other white children. So we were bused out to other white schools, but we still didn't integrate with white students because of white flight. All the white students were moved out of the school, so we were still with black children. We just had to stand on the bus stops longer and be out early in the morning and be away from home a longer time.
But through all this, the one thing black families could usually rely on was good jobs in the industrial sector. But beginning in the 1980s, major industries began moving out of Milwaukee. This city, like so many others, was transitioning from an industrial to a service economy.
I noticed this graphically in a neighborhood story I was doing at that time. What struck me was that almost invariably, when I talked to an older black man, he was doing well. He had recently retired from a factory job, and he was living okay. When I talked to a younger black man in his 30s or 40s, almost invariably, he had recently been laid off from work, and he was at wit's end. He did not know how he was going to make a living and how he was going to support this family. And when I talked with young black men, that is men in their teen years or older teens or early 20s, that young man almost had no job history, didn't have that factory experience that was the economic foundation for the black community up until that time.
While those we interviewed disagreed over welfare reform in Wisconsin, major shifts in funding from aid into training meant that many black families had lost their safety net.
You know, it has become sort of a stereotype that welfare was something for blacks. Ironically, most people on welfare in America are not black, but for whatever reason, people equate black with welfare.
W-2 was disguised as a way of benefiting the people that's on welfare, get them to go to work, when in fact what W-2 did was supplanted people who were losing jobs in corporate America and all these middle managers. W-2 then became their employment because they took the money from the poor and the needy to give to those people in the middle.
All these factors, systemic segregation, displacement of the village, loss of family supporting jobs, and lowering of the safety net, eventually began to erode hope among some area African Americans. Poverty increased, as did single-parent households and crime. And some have argued that the criminal justice system itself has played a role in eroding this hope among younger African Americans.
When we talk about what's happening with our children and how the recidivism is so high, we find many of our kids don't understand what's really going to happen to them once they pick up a felony charge. Once they're out of prison, they find they cannot possibly go on to school, they can't go into military, and in many situations, they can't even find jobs. And you know, their future outlook and their survival is pretty dim. It almost throws them right back into that cycle of survival, which put them in jail in the first place.
Despite the history of constraints and discrimination at the national and local levels, only some African Americans have despaired. Through seemingly insurmountable barriers, the majority of Black Americans have developed a dynamic and creative culture of contribution. African American culture developed through two general processes: the blending of ethnic traditions and ongoing responses to social injustice. According to those who were interviewed, many Black Americans in Milwaukee and elsewhere developed three patterns of cultural practices through these processes, each adding something to the surrounding communities. 1. Voluntary service to others, a commitment to helping that can be seen in family and community relationships, as well as in the enterprises founded by African Americans. 2. A continuing reinvention of self, a creative way of redeveloping popular culture that transforms personal and group identities. 3. The will to struggle, a determined practice of holding one's own ground and resisting discrimination and exploitation. These traits were part of the heritage left by two individuals many call the father and mother of the Milwaukee Black community, C.L. Johnson and Bernice Lindsay.
Mr. Johnson, as everybody in the community called him Mr. Johnson, was a tremendous individual in that he had graduated from Tuskegee Institute under Booker T. Washington and actually came to Milwaukee with Booker T. Washington's philosophy, and that was to drop his bucket where he lived, and to help build a community. And to build a community, he did. He also helped petition the downtown YMCA to have a YMCA for African Americans. And that became the Booker T. Washington YMCA on 8th and Walnut. And that's where our social, cultural community grew up around just tremendously. That was the place where we'd go to socialize, to dances, at weddings, and all kinds of things. It was just tremendous. He helped the Columbia Savings and Loan get its charter. And how he helped was that when the banking commissioner withheld a charter back in the 1930s, 1940s, C.L. Johnson got in his car, went up to Wisconsin and snatched the charter out of his hand so that, and that's why we have the Columbia Savings and Loan right now, because of C.L. Johnson.
Mrs. Lindsay helped found many popular culture and service organizations in Milwaukee, including the Creative Center, a YWCA, a theater, and the Black self-help organization, the Mary Church Terrell Club. She fought tirelessly for fair housing, including the development of Milwaukee's first low-income housing project, the Hillside Terrace.
Mrs. Lindsay had control of the land where the Hillside Housing Project was, and the city took that away from her. And she didn't have any help, so by herself, she picked it. She became the first executive director of the YWCA, which was located on 8th and Wisconsin, 8th and Clark Street. And back during those days, the YWCA had a residential hall at 626 North Jackson, and white young ladies could come down, farmers could come down to Milwaukee, 18, 19, 20 years old, and stay in the residency hall until they got on their feet. Black young ladies could stay there, but could only stay for 2 weeks, then they had to get out. Well, Mrs. Lindsay thought there was something wrong with that, and so she started picketing and protesting the YWCA, her boss. And as a result, she got fired.
It's a better place because we had Mrs. Bernice Lindsay, who did so many marvelous things for recreation, for culture, and even for housing. When she bought a lot out on 44th north of Hampton, and the streets were not paved and all out there, but she asked some other people, and they built all new homes there north of Hampton.
Anthropologists and sociologists such as Carol Stack and Robin Jarrett have long pointed out the strength of reciprocal exchange networks among African Americans, particularly among those of low income. Stack refers to the obligation to give and exchange as an underlying element of Black identity. Relatives and close friends are obligated to care for each other's children. The elderly rarely end up in institutions, and money and other resources are often loaned out on a moment-to-moment basis, according to need.
Being a single parent, childcare has always been an issue. When my kids were younger, childcare was really an issue, but when they got to school age, and it wasn't just you know, having someone take care of them during the day. When I traveled, I would be gone for 2 and 3 days. And I was very fortunate and blessed that my mother, who's not around anymore, but was able to care for my children for those days I was out of town. I do have a lot of sisters, and they are also available to me. Sometimes I don't even ask their permission. I just take my daughter and just drop her off and speed off.
Among African Americans from all economic backgrounds, volunteering in the church and the community is an expected activity.
They're deacons in the churches. They're in the church organizations. They contribute to other people's education of their children. And in my day, in my youth, it was not unusual for a husband to die and his brother would adopt all his kids and raise them as his own. These kind of things have been going on forever.
This voluntary service extends beyond the local relationships. It is perhaps no coincidence that African American entrepreneurs and professionals have had strong success in the service industry, in consulting, military service, and service enterprises and agencies. In some cases, this niche was a result of being discriminatorily denied other options, and in other cases, it may have related to arrival times of blacks in Milwaukee. Blacks in the city have struggled to own and operate enterprises in a wide range of sectors, from industry to financial institutions, to retail markets, to restaurants and restaurant chains. Clearly, there has been a creative thrust among African Americans to fill gaps in the service industry as opportunities arose. Blacks have led enterprises and services to businesses, to children and youth, to families, to neighborhoods, to the hospitality industry, to the sick and bereaved. Services including printing, cosmetology, cleaning, education, computers, catering, landscaping, automotive, home improvement, building, and daycare. The gingerbread houses are examples of a grassroots effort to provide for the basic needs of Milwaukee children.
The purpose of the gingerbread houses is to take a street and make it where that young people that what you would call termed poor could find a secure, safe environment where they could call it their block and develop until they were older and gain confidence and become educated and become productive and be a real help and come back and keep the neighborhood what it should be. And that's why we took this block, was for kids and their parents, but mainly for children, to have a block they can call their own. As they say, this is our block.
African Americans have a vast inventory of traditions they can choose from when casting new cultural forms. They have practices carried over from Africa and practices borrowed from the scores of cultural groups they encountered in America. In addition, the racial barriers blacks have faced sometimes force them to be more creative than others in developing survival strategies. Strategies which themselves became cultural practices. It was in the private world of leisure time activities where African Americans were the freest to mold new cultural forms and practices. These forms show up in music, religion, art, dance, dress, celebrations, sports, games, and actual images of how to present oneself. How to be. Diverging social groups or subcultures have long been a part of African American life.
There are a lot of subcultures in the African American community. There are those that are organized and those that are not organized. Some of the organized ones might be like the Nation of Islam followers, different religious groups, Baptists, Methodists, Jehovah's Witnesses, different fraternities and sororities. There's also the educated and the non-educated. There's working class and the poor class, or those that are in poverty that only associate with those that are in poverty. There's work cultures. There's also, there might be a dark skin, light skin group that hang out.
A recent African American reinvention of self is hip hop.
Now we come and we look at our young people of today, and I have found many of them are into this hip hop culture, and it has affected many of our young people in the way the clothes that they wear. Chains, the diamonds, want to drive the big cars, the language. There's actually a different language, like, yo, what's up in there, you know, and the signs, not just gang signs and things and that, but everyone has a different means of greeting, and it's a language within itself that was created through hip-hop, what they called hip-hop, which is now considered an actual music. But you know, they look at hip-hop and they talk about, it's always about sex or how bad I am, or let's shoot this, let's kill this, but it's not all that. You also have gospel rappers that are out here and is just as popular as the regular R&B rap area, because you have gospel rappers that talk about heart and soul and feelings, but it's in a positive, motivational area.
Young people who embody the hip-hop image do not necessarily leave other black cultural models behind.
I listen to music that, you know, might be offensive and might come off the wrong way, but then again, I also listen to gospel music and church music because that's a huge part of who I am, and I've grown up in the church all my life.
Ann Brown, proprietor of the Devonshire Victorian Tea House, is an excellent example of an adult who blended cultural traditions to create her own persona and her own enterprise.
I'm what is known as an Anglophile, which means that you basically like everything that has to do with English style, different things. And I love Queen Anne furniture, things like that, and I've always been like that. And the business that I was running before I started this one was a maid and butler service that was actually party service and catering. And in 1994, when I was in England, I decided to do research on tea and cater small tea parties. And while I was researching all of this, I ended up going to Long Beach, California, where they took us on what's called a tea tramp. And they took us to different tea rooms. At the time, I still wasn't thinking in terms of opening up a tea room, but when I got back, I was discussing it with friends and family, and they were saying, as opposed to going all over the city doing small tea parties, if you opened up a tea room, then everyone could come to you.
While African Americans have borrowed cultural forms from other ethnic groups, they have clearly made their own contributions to the wider society. In the realms of leisure time activities, popular culture, and image making, there is perhaps no group that has contributed as much to the U.S. social community as Black Americans. Contributions that include, among others, music forms such as spirituals, jazz, rhythm and blues, rock and roll, and rap.
If you look at rock and roll, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and others black folks aren't given credit for their participation in forming that style of music, along with Elvis and Pat Boone. And Pat Boone, for instance, and others made covers of black songs, and when they recorded them as white men, they were high selling. When black folks performed them, oftentimes they had trouble finding a performing hall and receiving their rightful pay.
Black Americans here and elsewhere have engaged in ongoing, determined efforts to resist oppression, discrimination, and exploitation. At times, these efforts have been en masse, and at other times they have been the work of single individuals. In Milwaukee, this raw will to hold one's own ground, to effect policy change, was demonstrated by some of the community's earliest leaders, then on through the civil rights movement and beyond.
I remember the time the John Williamson family had purchased a home, maybe as the first blacks, at 12th and Capitol Drive, only to have some young white kids burn a cross in front of their home. And then some years later, in 1969, they bought a parade of homes, model homes, out in Waukesha County. And we also saw that with Zeddy Hyler in Wauwatosa, being the first black there, that house was vandalized, along with other prominent people who lived in Wauwatosa. But they all stood tall, and they have made very good contributions.
My mother and my grandmother, my mother is Claretta Mother Freedom Simpson. She is now 100 years old, just celebrated her 100th birthday. They call her Claretta Mother Freedom Simpson because throughout all these many, many years, she has always fought for freedom and the betterment of our black people in America. We went through the riots even here in Milwaukee. She marched with Dr. King. She marched with Gruppy, Jesse Jackson. She was in Selma, Alabama, Montgomery. She's been bitten by dogs, hit by the police, and actually put in jail, even right here in Milwaukee, during the marches for our public schools.
We had a wonderful experience with the Civil Rights era. It was exciting, it was dynamic, it was uniting in that we knew we were right. And that just had an energy behind it. We knew that racism was wrong. We knew that Jim Crowism was wrong. We knew it was wrong to punish another people, a group of people, simply because of the color of their skin. I mean, it was biblical as well as philosophical. It was just right.
Let me tell you one thing that even affects me to this day. I was about 9 years old, and my grandmother took me with her to the March on Washington. We went to Washington, D.C. We stayed there waiting for this speech by this great man. We stayed in a little place they had put up with a fence around it in tents, and they called it Resurrection City, and ate surplus food. They ended up calling it Mud City because it rained so much that the tents couldn't stay up and they fell down, so they called it Mud City. But it was a place they had put for all these people that had migrated to come to this March on Washington to hear this great man. The man that we all came there to see was Dr. Martin Luther King. That was when he actually delivered the speech, I Had a Dream.
The black struggle against discrimination became a model for many other groups, both here in Milwaukee and nationally. Practices such as protests, peace marches, sit-ins, demonstrations, creating newsworthy events, policy forums, and the sacrifices of some individuals who risked their actual lives to defy the status quo were those later adopted by other groups facing discrimination, such as women, Latinos, Asians, American Indians, gays, lesbians, bisexuals, and people living with disabilities. By developing and refining strategies to combat discrimination, blacks in all probability advanced social justice for every American. The three traits, voluntary service to others, reinvention of self, and the will to struggle, played roles in several movements and institutions founded in Milwaukee that have received national recognition. Still another program that has been expanded into a national model is Growing Power, founded by Will Allen.
Had gotten a call from Hunger Task Force, from the executive director, that a YWCA group wanted to start an organic garden, and they couldn't find anybody to help them, so she mentioned my name, and to make a long story short, I went and looked at the plot that they wanted to grow some produce on, and it was a little bit too small, so I donated a spot behind our greenhouses here on 55th and Silver Spring, and it was about in June. It was getting kind of late, and they grew some peppers and beans and tomatoes, and they had a pretty successful garden, and they got a call from the Milwaukee Journal, and the Journal sent out a writer and a photographer, and they did a pretty major story about urban kids growing organic produce and selling them at the Fondy Farmers Market, where I'm the president of co-op, and we gave them a stand there, and they sold their produce there and had a pretty successful project that first year. And from that article, I started getting calls from other groups throughout the city, schools, and other nonprofit organizations for me to set up similar projects for their kids to learn about where their food came from and how to grow food and that sort of thing.
And Milwaukee's Black community has often led the nation in educational reform.
Milwaukee, for a lot of different reasons, has become the educational mecca, not just of the United States, but of the world. The school choice program, which is the first in the country and the largest, with over 11,000 low-income children going to over 100 private schools, has become the centerpiece of reform in America. Charter schools with Dr. Howard Fuller have been a staple as we talk about how do we help improve educational options for the poor. But I think the most important piece of all of this leadership is that the parents have become empowered. And in Milwaukee, we're talking primarily about African American parents who today can choose any school in the city for their child, regardless of how much money they make.
Municipalities throughout the nation have been closely following these new Milwaukee models to consider them for their own educational goals. The Parental School Choice Program, founded by Wisconsin State Representative Polly Annette Williams, permits low-income families in Milwaukee to send their children to private schools of their choice. The cost is paid by the state.
It was about 6 schools that was involved in the beginning that helped us, or at least help mobilize the community or mobilize parents around the issue that we could, in fact, get money from the government for parents, for low-income parents, to choose a school outside of the public schools.
What is next for African Americans in Milwaukee? Will a community faced with such constraints and so often disrupted continue to make creative contributions to the wider society? Some feel confident that the Central City will be reclaimed as the heart of a strong Black community. A new entertainment district is now under construction in the area, and a Black developer with a vision named Beachy Brooks has created a model subdivision in the area once known as Bronzeville. Middle and upper middle class African Americans have been returning to the area.
It was certainly a dream of one young man that people of color would come back to the inner city and reinvest in the inner city and you know, build up that pride and that community that they used to have. His dream has become a reality. I am very pleased that I was fortunate enough to get a home in Halyard Park. What I have found since I've been in Halyard Park is the neighborhood, the relationships that we used to have, the community aspect that used to be a part of basically every African American community, and it has now been reestablished through Halyard Park.
But others worry that the community is now too fragmented to work effectively together. The will to struggle remains strong and can be garnered for collective action occasionally, such as during the Bush-Gore presidential election.
What we found was Tommy Thompson, Governor Tommy Thompson, guaranteeing that the state would be delivered to Bush, that this state, the state of Wisconsin, was not an issue, not a problem, we'll deliver the state. And there were those of us that went out and took that as throwing down the gauntlet. And we made sure that this state was delivered to Al Gore. So even though Al Gore was not selected as the president, he was certainly elected to be so in the state of Wisconsin. And I thought that outpouring of people that had never voted before, had never been involved in politics before, had never really got it before, that this was important to their lives, they got it this time.
But the real challenge ahead for Milwaukee Blacks is collective organizing around issues that concern their own community, issues such as crime, equal economic opportunities, the family, and the future of Black youth.
You know, we have a lot of assets here. We have a lot of intelligent people. We have a lot of high-profile African Americans here. But for some reason, and I don't know if it's the culture of Milwaukee, because I've never seen this in other towns, that we don't network with each other and strategize on how to change the political process for our benefit.
We walk away and blame our children. We know of whole communities where if a school-age child is seen standing on a corner, the police or someone in the community will contact someone. They will pick the child up. They will take the child to school. The entire community makes sure there is no such thing as truancy in their community. There is no such thing, you know, as children not going to school next door. You know, the churches get involved. They know the children that are not being fed, and they know the children, and they do their part. But this can't be done in small segments. It has to take the entire community joining forces if we're going to save our kids today.
Perhaps one way to start is to look back, to recall the sacrifices of those who created opportunities, to recognize the powerful contributions that African Americans have made to local and wider communities, and to re-examine the ways those benefits have been created over time.
When I go back and look at my own childhood, it's very clear the roles that various people played. And so the fact that I was able to become the superintendent of Milwaukee Public Schools was because of the work that others had done before me. And I always felt and feel like I'm standing on the shoulders of people like Mr. Wesley Scott, Mr. Tom Cheeks, Vel Phillips, all of these people who went before us, who like paved the way so that we can do certain things that we're able to do today.